Hi everyone, I'm Trish Tagley and welcome to Trish Time. Today on our show we have Jessica Bacal, who is a lawyer working up here in Westchester and Manhattan, and she's going to speak to us on her experience and background and her advice for up-and-coming lawyers in New York State. So Jessica, welcome to the show. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Trish. I'm delighted to be here.
And let me ask you this question, because we did talk, and we've known each other, and we've talked about this before. But how did a woman who studied Oriental history, African studies, Spanish, how did you end up in law?
It isn't as peculiar as it may seem, but I attended and graduated from Vassar College at a time when it was all girls. And I took my junior year abroad and wound up spending much of my time at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, as well as at the London School of Economics. And I was a history major at Vassar, and it was a great opportunity to learn history from a very different perspective. For one thing, the English perspective, as far as the American Revolution is concerned, is a little different from ours. So right there we differed, and it was an opportunity to learn and also to teach, because the students at the girls' school at the University of London that I was attending had very different views of the Americans at that time. And I think that learning about Africa and Asia is really an integral part of any historian's background. And when I came back to the United States, seeing and encountering very different legal systems, not so much in England, obviously, since our system is based on theirs, and on the common law tradition. But I had an opportunity to travel in Europe, and of course, Napoleonic law is very different from our tradition. And that's what led me, along with the fact that I understood that at most of the law schools at that time, it was boys. So to find the boys, I went to law school, and then I wound up being a lawyer.
So there you go. So it was the boys. But you mentioned a little bit, and maybe, see if you want to explore this, but you mentioned a little bit that the way they spoke about history and discussed history in class was a little different, or is a little different than the way we discuss it. Is there something that you recall that there's a difference about? Because you also said it was an opportunity to teach.
Well, I don't recall anything specific, but certainly the English perspective on the American Revolution was that it was a bunch of malcontents who caused all these problems, which came at a time when the crown was weak, and the British lost an important colony. We, of course, see it as our opportunity to be free from the kind of unfair taxation. There was no representation, and so the two really are quite different. Just as today, whether an issue is deemed to be an uprising or a riot, is a controversy that is discussed at this time.
Well, let's talk about another major change in your life. You are from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I'm wondering, how did a woman from Sioux Falls end up in New York?
Well, there aren't too many of us, actually. For one thing, the path from out of Sioux Falls or out of South Dakota generally is to keep going west. And so when my parents ultimately moved from New York to Los Angeles, my mother said every time she went into the supermarket, somebody would yell, "Roz, how are you?" Because they were all coming from South Dakota, many of her friends. It's more unusual to go back east. But what brought me here was my parents, because my dad was a musician, and he was with the big bands in the days before I was born, and then the work for a musician was in New York at that time, and he worked on shows like Name That Tune and Stop the Music, and worked on Broadway before the music industry then moved out to California. And then he lived in LA for many years and worked with Stevie Wonder, among others, and worked at the library, the Los Angeles Library, to create a very well-respected music section.
That's really an interesting background that you have there.
Yes, well, unfortunately, I don't possess the same talent that my father did, so I'm a lawyer. Although one of my sisters was I guess it was all county flute here in Westchester, but she went on to become a doctor. So my father's heart was broken. Of his 4 children, nobody
took music.
No. Well, we played it, but not well enough for anybody to want to hear it.
No, Name That Tune for you.
No, exactly. So we're waiting for the next generation at this point.
Sometimes it'll manifest itself in the next generation.
We're hoping.
Yes, exactly. So tell us a little bit more about your practice and the different areas that you practice in.
Well, after I graduated from law school, and I graduated from Columbia at a time when it was mostly men, and I was also there during the Revolution. It was very difficult for women to find jobs with any of the private firms. It was hard to find work, period. One of the smartest girls in my class she went to the DA's office, Manhattan DA's office, and it was about 15 years before she was actually allowed to argue in court. She was in the back room writing the notes, the briefs, but wasn't. So it was a different era. And my first job out of law school was with the New York State Banking Department, because it was easier to find work in government. It was a fascinating time, and I really enjoyed learning about banking law. It's not something that you study in law school. It's more kind of esoteric subject. And then from there, the career pathway is to join the industry that you've learned how to regulate. And so I joined a very large bank, and I worked for the bank holding company, and did that for several years until, like so many women, biology got in the way. I got pregnant. I wanted to stay home with this adorable creature that I had produced, and then the others that came after. So I took more than a decade to stay home with my children, something that a lot of young women can't do today. It's regarded as the ultimate
sacrifice.
Yes, right. Or the ability to do it is considered something that is beyond the means of most women. So I was very fortunate. I took those 10 years, and then when I was ready to come back, or not ready, but I had to come back at that point to my career, rather than go into Manhattan from northern Westchester, because I still had a little one in kindergarten, I transformed myself into a local lawyer. Before I had been a banking and corporate attorney. Now I became a country lawyer, and or a suburban lawyer.
Up county.
And up county, yeah, up county. Well, if you're in White Plains and you're up county, they think you're upstate. And then you're a country lawyer,
yes.
even if you don't think so.
Yes.
And they use country in a less than complimentary way. I would say it's even pejorative.
Yes,
but
I get that.
I embrace it. I'm from South Dakota. Anything country is fine with me. But there I learned how to do regular closings and represent people who need wills and trusts, and help people create small businesses. And because I think most women can't get away from it, I also do matrimonial and family work. And I enjoy that as well, because I help people to end a relationship which is not working and go on to enjoy the rest of their lives.
So you mentioned different areas and also different sectors. So you've worked in the private sector, and then you've also worked in the public sector. Now, do you find that there's a difference with regard to the environment? I know that it was slightly a different time and it was harder for women, but even I think it's still harder for women, but in a different sense. But from your experience, like, what was the difference between public and private?
Well, rather than just look at the public sphere, which I joined when I got out of law school, I also worked for almost 20 years in the town of Lewisboro in a variety of positions. I started off right at the very bottom as a volunteer, as a in the environmental area, and then I was on the planning board, and then I was chair of the planning board, and then I ran for office on the town board, and I was elected twice, and I was also appointed as the town attorney. But those are part-time positions, and some paid and some didn't. When I say paid, I think there was a stipend. But I'm not sure that there's a great difference between public service and working in the private sector, because in my case, the private sector is my own office, my own law office, and I hire and I pay people to help me in my firm, but it's really my own office. So it's a little different from the private sphere when you're working for someone else for a salary to do certain things, and that's your obligation. When you're working in the public sphere, especially as a if not volunteer, on a part-time basis, then you're doing it usually for public benefit. You're really trying to make a difference, and I think that most of the people I have encountered who do this sort of thing, and many lawyers do, and I was privileged to meet many of them, including in Greenberg and throughout Westchester and Putnam counties, as well as in Dutchess. Most people who work in that sphere do it to enhance their communities and to help out, to assist, and to bring their background and their knowledge into the area of government where they can be most effective.
I actually, your view of both worlds is so generous. I actually have some slight experience volunteering for a board, for a town board, for a certain project, and for me, I found the difference was the way decisions were made. I was I'm a very what is the issue? What is the situation? These are the solutions, and let's go. And I found that that's not exactly how it works in the public sphere, as you said.
No, it can't, because the public sphere wants to be sure that as many people have an opportunity to complain as well as to contribute. Mm-hmm. And no decision should be made without input. Mm-hmm. And that slows things down.
Oh, tremendously.
Yes.
Tremendously. I agree with you. And of course, there's a benefit to hearing from more people than not. And I do agree with you that, especially if you're working in a public sphere, that, everybody, different groups should have a say, and how whatever decision it is that affects them should be counted. So I totally agree with you on that.
But it's maddening.
It is.
It's very frustrating, yes. Especially when the options are limited. Mm-hmm. There really aren't very many different ways to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And you still have to go through the whole process.
Yes. I guess for me, the reason why it was maddening, to use that term, was, for me, every hour was money. And that's the way, because that's the way we look at it in the private sector. And I'm like, like you said, there are limited options, so why don't we just go with the best option? We all know what it is. But like you said, it's a process, and it's just something that that's the way it exists. That's the way it works. Right. And it obviously works.
But it becomes more expensive. And
it
that,
does.
And
it
that
does.
can be a problem when you're trying to explain to either a client or your own organization why it costs so much money. And that's part of the process. It's very aggravating in many ways, but the opposite of that would be so much worse in terms of a process. It would mean that somebody gets to make the trains run on time, and we don't want that. Much as we like to have the trains run on time, we don't want to live in a fascist dictatorship which can ensure that certain things happen.
True, true. So let me ask you about this too, because you're actually a columnist, you write. Tell us a little bit about that.
I was very fortunate several years ago to be approached by the owner of a magazine called New York Living Magazine. And he wanted a columnist to explain to his readers, who consisted primarily of, I would say, mostly Manhattanites and Brooklynites, but really the New York metropolitan area, to learn about the environmental regulations, as well as the issues that people at that time were not as familiar with as they are today. And so every time the magazine came out, which was once a month, I had a column which explained all kinds of things, from illnesses caused by basements that hadn't been properly inspected, to water, clean water, and how people who buy on a lake and think, isn't this lovely, have to understand that they have responsibilities for keeping that lake clean. And while there aren't many lake communities and lake homeowners associations that help people with it, this was designed to give people a heads up. And it was great fun. The the owner of the magazine was from Japan, and he, like so many New Yorkers, was from somewhere else. I was from South Dakota. He was from Japan, from Tokyo, and his concern, even before, and this was way before the problems of the nuclear reactor going haywire, He was concerned about those kind of problems as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, being from Tokyo, I think, me from Japan, I think that that is something that, because of the history, obviously,
Yes.
that they would be concerned about.
Right.
It would be more top of mind than, let's say, an American.
Or somebody from, say, Bogota.
Yes,
Or,
agreed.
right?
Agreed.
Yes, because that's the one country that really suffered the consequences of an intentional nuclear explosion. But it's also a country that came very close, yet again, to that kind of terrible scenario. It was much worse there a few years ago than it was at 3 Mile Island, for example, where it was scary enough.
Exactly. So having this varied background and all this knowledge with regard to different types of people and cultures and all that, and again, mentioning that women had different issues with regard to finding work, what is a piece of advice or philosophy that you have that you could share with up and coming women and women lawyers, women in general?
Well, it's funny you use the word general, because I was about to say that generals tend to fight tomorrow's wars with last year's experience, and they're going on with their cannons when there are nuclear weapons. I'm not sure that I would have anything all that helpful to say to younger women who are looking for careers, because so much has changed. That doesn't mean that all the change has been for the good, and it doesn't mean that women don't have many challenges. I think it's, my daughter is a physician. She's what you call an MD, PhD. So she's what she calls a double doctor, and she's a mother. It's hard. It's very hard finding childcare, trying to keep your career moving. I think it's very difficult for young women today. I have an assistant who has 2 children, a little girl who hasn't started school yet. She had to find proper daycare there. Her big boy is already in 1st grade. To work and to leave the home, to come back at certain hours, children get sick, children require tremendous amount of attention and money, and it's very, very difficult. I think that women have made tremendous strides. I was part of the class at Vassar that you probably read about. That one of the women in my class wrote a book about good girls, and they've made it into one of the TV series and movies. I don't think there's any one way of doing it right. There are many ways to do it wrong. And I think that just persevering and waiting for more women to be in political office, especially on the federal level, where they once paid farmers not to grow wheat. I think they should pay women to stay home with their children. There should be, depending on where you are at the point that you wish to stay with your family, what is your educational background? Have you taken any child rearing courses? Depending on everybody's situation, because people are different. But there should be a tax rebate. There should be ways to reward women for caring for their children rather than punishing them. And there should be ways for women to continue to work. And here the law firms, the major law firms, have made tremendous changes, but there's still a long, long way to go. And by the way, those those changes in the law offices were made by guys in my class. Those were the guys who recognized and were not antithetical to women being in the class. I think the professors may have been, but not those guys. And when their daughters and sons reached the age where they were going to law school and then finding jobs, these were the men and some of the women who
Pioneered, yeah.
Right, who changed things so that people could be parents and retain their career drive.
Yes, well, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our show. So again, like I said, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes,
Trish.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, because I know you're really busy. And I hope you learned about the different issues either in the private sector or in the public sector, and how we'd like to see these change and what changes actually should happen in order to help women move forward with their personal lives and their career. Thank you so much for joining Trish Time. I'll see you again. Bye-bye.